This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first Memphis Heritage Trail virtual book series. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Lauren Barksdale, and I will be your host for the afternoon. I would like to mention to everyone that is in attendance that this program is recorded. So that I ask you all that if you do not want to be on screen, to please take yourselves off camera at this moment. Again, this program is in the process of being recorded. Again, welcome to our first annual virtual book series. Again, my name is Lauren Barksdale, and I will be your host. Today, we are featuring the latest publication from author G. Wayne Dowdy, Enslavement in Memphis. A little bit about our team behind the scenes. We have Felicia Harris. Felicia L. Harris serves as the Planning and Policy Administrator for the City of Memphis's Division of Housing and Community Development. In this role, Felicia coordinates citywide planning projects related to housing and community development. Felicia is the Program Manager for the Memphis Heritage Trail. A native Memphian, Felicia completed her graduate studies in applied cultural anthropology at the University of Memphis with an emphasis in medical and urban anthropology. Felicia enjoys serving on local and global communities. She serves on the Memphis NAACP Executive Committee, chairs the Housing and 588 Vance Committee, State of Tennessee Parks, and Black Heritage Advisory Board, and the Memphis FilmWorks Board. Our moderator for the afternoon is Mr. Miles Carter. Miles Carter is a graduate student in the City and Regional Planning Program at the University of Memphis. Miles has a background in horticulture, landscape design, and data analysis. He's currently an intern with the Division of Housing and Community Development, assisting with research for ongoing Memphis Heritage Trail projects. And I am your host, Lauren Barksdale. I am a Memphis native. I've held a lifelong passion for preserving public history in Memphis. I hold a background in English and African American studies and education from the University of Memphis. For several years, I worked as a history teacher in the local school district. After transitioning from the classroom, I currently work as a planning analysis for the City of Memphis's Housing and Community Development and programming for all things Memphis Heritage Trail. Presently, I am completing my graduate studies in African American history and public history at the Jackson State University. In a moment, we will hear from our guest author. Then we will move into a Q&A segment moderated by Miles Carter and closing remarks. I would like to note that since we all are attending virtually, if we ask that you all would go ahead and sign into our chat room by writing your name and email addresses down so that we can keep you updated on all things Memphis Heritage Trail. In 2008, the City of Memphis Division in Housing and Community Development realized a need to acknowledge and recognize the contributions of local African Americans. In 2014, the city was awarded a $150,000 grant from the National Endowment for the Arts to develop a master plan for the Renaissance of African American cultural heritage expressed through the Memphis Heritage Trail. The Memphis Heritage Trail officially launched in April 2018 during MLK 50th, a citywide initiative to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memphis Heritage Trail consists of 4 loops: civil rights, entertainment, commerce, and residential. For MLK 50th, the civil rights loop was open. The Memphis Heritage Trail core area is the South City neighborhood. The trail includes the southern quadrant of downtown, but is mostly situated in South Memphis, an area of the city where African Americans settled during the Civil War and following emancipation. These early contraband and free communities represent the beginnings of African American placemaking in Memphis. By the end of the war, about 17,000 African Americans had settled in the city. They founded neighborhoods and built homes, churches, schools, and social institutions. Some of those individuals include millionaire Robert R. Church Sr., musical child prodigy Julia B. Hooks, civil rights activist and writer Ida B. Wells. The growth of South Memphis paralleled Greater Memphis with African Americans creating similar, though racialized, ways of life and community building. The intellectualism and musical innovation reflects the nexus of African American culture, civil rights advocacy, and entrepreneurship. The Memphis Heritage Trail encompasses more than 60 sites, including following anchors, Claiborne Temple, I Am a Man Plaza, the National Civil Rights Museum, historic First Baptist Beale Street Church, Martin Luther King Jr. Reflection Park, Beale Street, W.C. Handy House Museum, Robert R. Church Park, and the Withers Collection Museum and Gallery. The Memphis Heritage Trail is also linked to African American sites in other neighborhoods slightly beyond the trail boundaries of downtown, which include Uptown, Soulsville, USA, and Orange Mound. Cultural assets within these neighborhoods include Slave Haven Underground Railroad Museum, Four-Way Restaurant, Stax Museum of American Soul Music, Lemoyne-on College, and historic Melrose High School. Our latest Memphis Heritage programming endeavor is our monthly virtual book series, where we host local authors and their latest work highlighting the history, culture, and legacies of African Americans in Memphis, Tennessee. Our next book series will be on Thursday, March the 10th at 2 p.m., where we will host Dr. Ernestine Jenkins and her latest publication, Black Artists in America, from the Great Depression to Civil Rights. Other upcoming events with the Memphis Heritage Trail are our our 2022 Trailblazer Awards on February the 28th, 2022 at the Hollerwin Center. The event is free to the public. You are encouraged to register via Eventbrite as seating is limited. The reception starts at 4:30 and the ceremony begins at 5:30. Forthcoming in the spring, the Memphis Heritage Trail will launch new wayfinding signage in South City and Soulsville neighborhoods. There you can learn more about the rich history of the communities as well as its residents. We encourage and invite all of you all to download the Memphis Heritage Trail app and visit our Memphis Heritage Trail website at www.memphisheritagetrail.com and follow the Memphis Heritage Trail on social media platforms. We are launched on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please feel free to like, share, and comment on today's event. So it brings me without further delay a great pleasure to introduce to you all our guest for the hour, author G. Wayne Dowdy. Mr. Dowdy is the senior manager of the Memphis Public Library's History Department. He holds a master's degree in history from the University of Arkansas. Mr. Dowdy is a contributing writer for the Best Times magazine and Storyboard Memphis. He is the author of 8 books, including A Brief History of Memphis, Enslavement in Memphis, and On This Day in Memphis History, which was awarded a Certificate of Merit by the Tennessee Historical Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you all Mr. G. Wayne Dowdy. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. What I thought I would do is just read an excerpt from the book, and then we'll go into the questions and so on. Matilda was born in 1830 to a free black family who were illegally being held as slaves. Abolitionist lawyers brought suit to free Matilda, her mother, her sister Mary Ellen, and Mary Ellen's 7 children. When he learned of the suit, a white man named Robert Logan seized the family and sold them to 2 Memphis slave traders named Collins and Woods. They were unconcerned with the family's questionable legal status, and neither was Nathan Bedford Forrest. He purchased them from Collins and Woods and made them available in his yard. Soon after they arrived in Memphis, Boss McGee was in the market for additional slaves. While inspecting the new arrivals, he spied Matilda and Mary Ellen and immediately bought them. Matilda took over the cooking chores from Delia, and Mary Ellen was assigned to take care of Madam's sister, Mrs. Farrington. Tortured by the knowledge that she was free, Matilda's sad face and angry demeanor made the McGees uneasy. Even Madam refrained from whipping her. Lewis was drawn to this broken-hearted woman, and as time passed, the two fell in love. Boss had often promised Lewis that when he decided to marry, he would give him a nice wedding. True to his word, Lewis and Matilda were married in the McGee's parlor by the family's minister. The wedding he gave us was indeed a pleasant one, Lewis would later write. Happiness was fleeting for all slaves, as Lewis learned when he overheard old Master Jack remark, "It will ruin them, given weddings." Madam's violent outbursts continued as Lewis and Matilda settled into married life. She grew to hate Matilda, whose dignified manner frightened and enraged her. A year later, Matilda gave birth to twins, providing Madam with an instrument of revenge. Boss told Lewis to help his wife in the kitchen so she would have time to nurse the babies. Madam had other plans. She increased his duties so he had no time to assist his wife in her work. According to Lewis, a typical day for Matilda went like this. In the morning, she would nurse the babies, then hurry off to the kitchen to get breakfast while they were left in charge of a little girl. Again at noon, she repeated her visit to the babies after cooking the dinner. Then in the evening, after supper, she would go to nurse them again. After supper was over, dishes all washed and kitchen in order, she would then go to the little ones for the night. The children began to wither away from lack of proper care. A doctor was called, and after examining Matilda, he stated that the babies were not getting enough nutrition because of their mother's constant and excessive labors. Watching their children slowly die naturally had a profound effect on Lewis and Matilda. At first, Matilda turned to faith. God will help us. Let us try and be patient, she told her husband. As time went on, however, both found themselves in the grip of despair. It was then that Madam chose to strike. One morning she approached Matilda, vowing to give her a beating. "You shall not whip me," Matilda quietly declared. Madam flew into a rage, and Matilda fought back. In reply to Madam's screams, Boss arrived and grabbed Matilda by the throat. In the next room stood Lewis, boiling with anger but shackled by fear and common sense. The violent moments soon passed, but Matilda had had enough. She grabbed her babies, packed their clothes, and set out for downtown Memphis. All Lewis could do was hand her a few coins he had collected from the tips of white people. Matilda marched straight to Forrest's slave market. As she sat beside the yard's back gate, it soon swung open, and Forrest passed through. "My God, Matilda, what are you doing here? You have changed so I would not have known you. Why have you come here?" Forrest asked. When she explained that she wanted to be sold because of the cruel treatment she received, Forrest replied, "I know these McGees. They are colts." He then called for the slave trader Collins to express interest in buying her. While Collins was looking over Matilda, all arrived vowing to never sell her. On their way back to the house, Boss turned to Matilda and said ominously, "When I'm through with you, I guess you won't run away again." McGee placed her in the same wooden stocks that had once restrained her husband, and the couple took turns beating Matilda with a whip. As before, Lewis stood nearby, trembling from head to foot for being unable to stop the torture of his wife. A few months later, their twin babies died. Not long after the burial of their children, Matilda walked into the smokehouse with Madame trailing behind, proclaiming, "I'm tempted to take that knife from you, Matilda, and cut you in two. You went all around the neighborhood and told the people that I killed your babies and almost whipped you to death." So that is an excerpt from the book. And so I guess I'll turn it over to anyone who has anything to say or any questions.
I've got a few questions before we maybe turn it
Yeah,
over to the floor.
please.
So as a public historian, what inspired you to write enslavement in Memphis?
Well, there were several things. One, for as long as I've worked here, customers have come in and wanted to know about how slavery operated in the city. Where were people sold? Were there auctions? Were there, how did it work? And so that was one of the motivating factors. But really, the biggest one was the fact that so many books about slavery really end up talking more about white people than they do those who had been enslaved. Now, partly that's because the records are easier to find for the white owners than it is for the enslaved. But there's also, I think, a bit of a bias there that, the stories aren't available. But in fact, they are. There are many sources that you can find. Again, they're maybe not quite as easy to find as the ones where whites are reflected in, but they exist. And, as these books sort of, without intending to, but they end up being in some ways, African Americans get marginalized from their own story as if they're not the main figures, right? and that is something I wanted in a small way to correct. And so I focused most of my attention, as you saw, I hope from the excerpt, on the lives of the people who were enslaved. Whites obviously and the owners and the system play a role in all of this. You can't ignore it because it's so intertwined. But at the same time, my goal was to try and bring these people back to life, people whose voices have not been heard ever. And by giving them their voice, some dignity returned to them, and some element of redemption can come to us all.
Thank you for that, Wayne. Another question we have is, how has the legacy of slavery in Memphis shaped its present-day culture and social paradigm?
Well, I think the I think I think the effects of slavery are still played out on the streets of Memphis every day. I think we see it in a lot of different ways. We definitely, I think, see it in high rates of poverty that are generational, multi-generational poverty. And we also see it in the way that African Americans are still often treated as second class, or as marginalized, as not as important as whites. And I think that attitude is still there. There are many, many, many people trying to overcome that and are working very hard and are. But the old patterns remain, and we've yet to eradicate them completely. And specifically looking at the people that we were able to identify, I think one thing that we can understand from slavery and its effects on the future, what would be the future and the present day. There were many African American slaves who were skilled workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, plasterers, and other skilled work, barbers. And they, once slavery ended, then they were able to build their own businesses, enter the economic middle class, not the social middle class, but the economic middle class. And I think that is passed down generation to generation. That if you owned your own business, or you owned your own land, then you were more successful than the slaves who had only been trained to pick cotton and work in the field. And so there are people in the book, like a man named Joseph Clouston, who is a slave who, after the war, became a barber. Then he began investing money into real estate. He was elected to the Memphis City Council. And when he died, he was a very prominent citizen. But then on the other hand, another character in the book, Mary Herndon, was brought to Memphis from St. Louis in the 1850s, sold by Nathan Bedford Forrest to a farmer in Mason, Tennessee, just not terribly far from Memphis. And she worked the field. And that's all she knew. And so after emancipation, she continued to do what she always did, which is work the fields and pick cotton. So by the 1930s, which she's still very much alive in the 1930s, an elderly woman living in Memphis, she has nothing. She has no money. She's living in a borrowed room. She has no income. She simply has nothing to show for her decades of labor. And so people like Mary Herndon are the ones who end up being the urban poor. And so we can definitely see all of that played out today in Memphis.
So I think it's time to open up the floor for questions. It looks like Stacy Wilson has a question in the chat. I'll just go ahead and read that for her. How common or possible would it have been for someone to sell themselves as opposed to running away to be free?
It was uncommon, and that story of Matilda is fascinating in what it tells us, and also in what it doesn't tell us. It tells us that, I mean, Matilda was a very smart woman. I mean, she knew that with the children, that carrying the children, that it would be, and without documentation, it would be very difficult for her to escape. So instead, she did what she thought was the logical choice, which makes a sense, that she would go back hoping that she would find somebody better, at least in the short term. Remember, these are human beings just like us, who are faced with circumstances beyond their control. But that's the only incident that I found where a slave went to a slave dealer and said, "Sell me." I think that was rather unique, and I think it speaks to the intelligence of Matilda Hughes, Mrs. Matilda Hughes, how intelligent she was. She was trying to make a bad situation a little bit better, and it also shows us how unscrupulous slave traders were. I mean, committed all, then they would have to turn her back over to the McGees. But instead, he's like, "Yeah, I see another way to make money again," and they were quite willing to essentially steal her, as awful as that sounds. And but I think it was unique. Most of the time, when slaves escaped, they didn't go trying to sell themselves. They tried to get out of the South. There was a man named Thomas Bland, who also worked for the McGees, who was taught how to read and write from some skilled slaves, plasterers that McGee had hired on his place. And when he learned how to read and write sufficiently, he wrote a pass for himself, forged McGee's signature to it, saying that he had permission to sell his labor to anyone who would hire him, and that they could keep him and pay him as long as they wanted. Well, he went to a boat at the wharf and presented it to the pilot, and the pilot hired him. And 24 hours later, he's in Ohio, and he makes it all the way to Canada. And once he's settled in Canada, he sends a letter back to McGee saying, "Guess what? I'm in Canada, and you can't touch me." So, but I think that's I went a little bit around the long way around the barn, but I think that's rather unique from what I've seen.
There's another question in the chat from Carolyn Michael Banks. She asked if you could clarify the history of Auction Square at Main and A.W. Willis. And I'll just say, anyone
Yeah.
who has questions can feel free to speak up. Just make sure you mute after you're done.
Auction Square was one of 4 public places that were laid out in the original 1819 street design for the city. And it was auction, market, court, and forgive me, I've forgotten the 4th one. Anyway, it was not necessarily established as an auction for slaves. Part of that is the reason we know this is that in 1819, slavery was very, very small in Memphis. It was not a major factor in the economy. Most of the slaves worked on the wharf. The few that were here worked on the wharf, loading and unloading the flatboats that came into the city. And then there were, we know of some slaves that were owned by a man named Patrick Mager, who owned a tavern and sort of inn. He was an innkeeper. And there were 2 slaves that he owned who worked at the inn, chopping firewood for the fire, helping to prepare meals for customers, and anything else that Mager wanted to needed done. So there was no need for them to be thinking in terms of, oh, there's going to be thousands of auctions like there would be in Charleston or New Orleans. They were, as far as we can tell, that was just it was going to be a commercial center, or at least that was the thought. In the 1920s, the Colonial Danes, which is a genealogical heritage organization, they put a block in Auction Square with a sign that was to essentially to signify the significance of the Colonial Dames and also Memphis's involvement in the Revolutionary War, which was not very much, but nevertheless, this was a contested territory between Britain, the United States, and then in earlier and later Spain and France. So at some point, the plaque was lost. Somebody stole it, or it fell off, and so people then assumed that was an auction block, but it wasn't. There was no auction block there. There were plenty of auctions that took place in Memphis selling slaves. Most of them were held on the front steps of the Commercial Hotel, where merchants, commercial merchants, would have offices in the hotel, and they would simply auction them out in front. There also were auctions that were took place in Court Square, and we have that from advertisements and so on. So those were really the two places where auctions did take place. This Tennessee was rather unique. The state made it illegal to trade in slaves in throughout the state. Individuals, if I owned a slave or if I bought a slave and then wanted to turn around and sell it, then you could do that. But you couldn't buy 100 slaves, import them into the state, and then resell them. That was technically illegal. So the guys who were working in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s are basically selling small numbers, many of them auctioning them off, sometimes just simply, hey, I'll give you $500, like people do with, sad to say, like cars or any other commodity. And so yeah, but Auction Square was never used I didn't find any record of Auction Square ever being used as a slave auction.
Hey, Miles, this is Jimmy Tucker. I'd like to
Hey,
ask
Jim.
a question. Wayne, really appreciate you sharing your book today. I guess what I'm trying to understand is more of sort of what is the way in which people in the community looked at what's happening. Really, human beings are being sold. What
Right.
is are we seeing that there's differences of opinion about this, and some people are obviously in support of it, but what's the level of resistance? Or this is really something, to be quite honest, I'm really confused about the whole social dynamic that might have been taking place. So can you enlighten me, provide some insight?
Yep. Be glad to. When the city was founded in 1819, as I said, slavery was very, very small. That was true throughout the 1820s. And there are many whites who are very uncomfortable by slavery, how inconsistent it is with the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and this whole concept of liberty for all, right? And slavery not being very economically important to the city, which is a key factor. There are many who want to abolish slavery in the state of Tennessee. And there are various schemes that are taking place. The earliest one in the 1820s was a woman named Frances Wright. She was from Scotland, and she was a reformer, and she was appalled by American slavery. And so she developed a program to purchase slaves, take them to a farm she built called I'll remember it in just a second, Neshoba, and they would be trained in skills, then set free. And she got powerful support for this. Andrew Jackson, who would later become president later that decade, she met with him in Nashville and said, where in Tennessee could I buy some land? And he said, I own land or have interest in Shelby County. It'd be the best place for you. So she comes to Memphis, buys land out roughly Bartlett, Germantown area, closer to Bartlett than it would be Germantown, but in that rural area. And she begins to purchase slaves to then train them and set them free. Unfortunately, she became ill very quickly, had to go back to a place up north to rest and recuperate. There was some poor leadership at the farm, and also most of the people that were purchased to work there were not agricultural workers. Most of them were people like Matilda and Lewis who worked in the house. And so they did not have the skills to maintain a farm. And farming is hard work, always has been. And if you don't know what you're doing, it's easy to fail. So it did fail, but what's important from our perspective is that it shows that there is a level of disdain towards slavery. No one tried to run her out of Shelby County. No one tried to destroy the property or stop her. In fact, she received a great deal of support. But that's not just altruism. I mean, there's an economic element to this as well, that it's simply not that important, so they don't really care about it. In the early 1830s, the state of Tennessee called a constitutional convention to write a new constitution. The voters in Memphis selected a delegate to the convention, our Memphis's representative, who was anti-slavery, who brought with him a proposal to gradually emancipate slaves and send them back to Africa, which was a foolish notion because this is their country. This is what they know. So that part of it was nonsense, but there was a sincere effort, but it didn't work. And delegates from the other part of the state strengthened slavery and put slavery in the state constitution, which is not something that Memphis wanted. So in the early days, there was in the 1820s and 1830s, was a great deal of slavery support. However, as it becomes the big industry in this area, there is a constant need for more labor. And thousands of bales of cotton, tens of thousands, by the 1840s is passing through Memphis. It is the key to Memphis's economy. In the 1850s, Memphis is the fastest growing city in the United States. And it's because of cotton and it's because of slavery. So then the position is reversed. White Memphians become committed to slavery. The state abolishes their ban on slave trading. You have Memphis becomes a very large, very lucrative slave trading city. And a good example of how whites viewed this, Nathan Bedford Forrest built his slave yard next to catty corner to Calvary Episcopal Church. Every Sunday, white Episcopalians walked down the street past Forest Slave Yard with all of these enslaved human beings inside what is essentially cages, and they think nothing of it. There's no opposition. The church doesn't go on record saying this should be ended. It is not only accepted, but in many ways encouraged and becomes central to white Southerners' notions of who they are and to their economic life. So you see this shift within a very short period of time, and it's all because of money. I mean, it comes down to money. Does that make sense?
Yes, greatly appreciate that additional perspective and insight, Wayne. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for that question, Jimmy. In the chat, I believe Michael, our coworker, he asked if there were African Americans in Memphis prior to 1819, and I guess I would add on if there were, at what level, like at what I guess what density at the time.
Very, very small. About the population of the city in 1819 is about 300 people, and there's about 50 African slaves who are here. And that would go back to, and there would be even fewer when when Fort Pickering was built. where the United States government established a trading post with the Chickasaw Indians, and there were a few slaves who were owned by the white settlers in the city, in the what would become the city. So extremely small, and most of them would be personal servants. That is to say, cooking for one guy or the guy's family, and it just simply wasn't integrated into the economy. And in fact, the city was populated for the most part by very free-thinking riverboat men, and they didn't like any authority whatsoever. And so many of them don't have an economic need for slaves. And so it's extreme. It's a very, very small, a very, very small number. But they are all, as soon as white Europeans are settling here, whether it be the Spanish or Great Britain / the United States, there are always a few slaves here because it is so ingrained into the culture.
Thank you for that, Wayne. It looks like we're getting a little short on time, so I'm going to go ahead and ask what you would recommend for people who are interested in documenting history. What sort of research methods and resources would you suggest for that?
Absolutely. When I started that, I thought that I was lucky for 200 names. The goal was to find 2 names of enslaved people. And I looked at some of the traditional sources, probate records, wills, for example, because people will leave slaves to family members, and they often will name them, not always, but sometimes. That's a great place to start. There is in 1850 and in 1860, the Census Bureau did a separate slave schedule. So they would list the numbers of slaves. Rarely did they mention names, but there are a few that mention names, but you at least get a number and understand. So that's a starting point. But there are other records. A really good one is the newspapers. There are advertisements for runaway slaves. There are advertisements for slaves that have been arrested by the Shelby County Sheriff, and he's by law required to advertise that he has what appears to be a runaway slave and where he's from and what his owner's name was, so that the owner could retrieve them. If they didn't retrieve them within a year, then at the end of the year, the sheriff could sell them, which they did in some cases. So all of those advertisements are fascinating because they, without necessarily meaning to, they the humanity of the enslaved people. They describe what they look like in many cases, which is important because it gives humanity to these dry statistics or whatever. And they also will talk about personality. There will they will say that this person is very smart, very sly. In one ad, they talked about how much how skilled he was at lying. So that tells us something about that human being. And then the newspapers, in addition to that, in addition to the period while slavery is in existence, in the decades after slavery ended, going into well into the 20th century, Southern newspapers love to write stories about former slaves. Some of them are very patronizing, some of them are racist, but some of them are not. Mary Herndon, we know about Mary Herndon, who I mentioned earlier, because in 1930, a white newspaper reporter went and interviewed her. And he was rather sympathetic. He did call her a mammy, and that sort of thing. And he does use dialect a little bit, which is offensive and not necessary. But but at the same time, he also lets Mary Herndon speak. She describes what happened when she got here. I look like I'm freezing. But she describes what it was like when she got here, how she was treated in the forest slave, how she was treated. She talked about having an accident where she lived. She also tells the story of during the Civil War, towards the end of her, soldier unions come by and say, "Ma'am, you're free," and so she takes that to heart. Oh, she didn't know where to go. She stays there, and the next morning she gets up, and the owner's wife says, "Get out to the field," and she said, "No, I'm free." And the owner's wife had a hoe in her hand. She took the hoe and hit her upside the head, and she carried a scar for the rest of her life. Well, the writer, the white writer, allows her to tell that story, and he prints it in the newspaper. And that doesn't speak very well for the white owner, does it not? So, and they give her that opportunity. There's another story about a man named Henry Davidson, who had come to Memphis as a young boy as a slave in the 1820s, and his owner was a Methodist minister, and his owner was one of the founders of what would become First Methodist Church. Well, Henry Davidson, when he died in 1908, was considered one of the founders of the church. He stayed in the white Methodist Church even after emancipation through the end of the 19th century into the first few years of the 20th. And the love that people seemed to have for him the love that white people had for him seemed to be sincere. And on the other hand, there are other stories where they are essentially making fun of the former slaves and taking advantage of them. And then there's also the other aspect that they love to tell stories when good white people helped out these former slaves. So it's patronizing, continuing sort of the notion that blacks should be subservient to whites or should be dependent on whites. So it runs the gamut, but it's great sources. And I didn't even think that was the case. I just took a shot and used our database to search for, see what would come up, that I was shocked to find. There are also many other sources that one might not think of. For example, I'm sure everyone knows about the 1866 massacre in Memphis. And the United States Congress sent an investigative team to Memphis to investigate and collect evidence about those crimes. And they interviewed many African Americans. And when they during their testimony, they were always asked, "Were you a slave? How long have you been free?" One of the best examples of that is in George, who was brought to Memphis, according to her testimony, in 2 weeks before Christmas in 1865. That means she was brought to Memphis just as the 13th Amendment was being ratified, which abolished slavery. She is asked, "How long have you been free?" And she says, "Well, about 6 months." Well, the testimony was taken in late May of 1866. So that means she was set free either at the very end of 1865 or the beginning of 1866. She was already free, but she was free from whatever owner and how that happened, we don't know. But nevertheless, that's a source that you wouldn't necessarily think of that would have that kind of information. But there's a lot there. We've been led to believe that there are very few sources for slaves. That's not true. There are quite a few. I mean, I found a lot, and I think there are others out there that I haven't seen or haven't been made available yet.
And Wayne, quickly, could you tell us maybe where we can find your book, and if there's any stores in town that are selling it, and also some of your other work about public history?
Yeah, I think Novel has copies. I know some of the Walgreens carries, believe it or not, and Costco carries this book and other books. Amazon, of course. There's a bookstore downtown, the Book Juggler on Main Street on South Main, that carries this book and some of my others. Just to say briefly that with all of my books, they're all about Memphis, all about different aspects of Memphis, 1950. And in many ways, what I'm doing is trying to write. I'm writing one big book. And so I've looked at one section of the book is about slavery, another about the restaurant industry, lost restaurants of Memphis, because it tells us something about the economy. And it also tells us a lot about the immigrant community in Memphis, because so many of the restaurants were owned by immigrants who came here from Eastern Europe and other places. And then On This Day in Memphis History was uh, designed to sort of give people small bursts of history that would help them understand the city. Then A Brief History is just an overview of a short overview. And then two of my other books, the book on E.H. Crump, Mayor Crump Don't Like It, is about the Crump machine and how it was organized. And then Crusades for Freedom is about the period 1948 to 1968 in Memphis and the growth of the civil rights movement and African American voting, and also the rise of the Republicans in what had been a one-party place. So yeah, you can find them, and we have copies here at the library as well. I don't want people to feel like they have to go out and buy, because the buying and selling of books is not important. What's important is that the information gets shared.
Thank you, everyone, for the questions, and thank you, Wayne, for your answers. I'm going to pass it over to Lauren
Yeah,
now.
please. Thank
Thank you
y'all.
so much, Wayne.
This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Wayne. I had a quick question for myself. You mentioned a lot about just, I think it's so just significant that you name names in this book, because like you
Yes.
said, it gets lost, and you give humanity to this inhumane institution. As a public historian in Memphis, what advice would you give other public historians? And I think a lot of people think you have to have formal education to be a public historian. Um, but what advice would you give? Because so much is discussed about the cotton industry in Memphis, and even the slave owners in Memphis, by way of several names like Bolton, Forrest, Dickens. How can we bring the history of slavery in Memphis to the forefront? I know it's an uncomfortable truth to talk about, but how can we change that narrative in Memphis?
I think the first thing is simply to talk about it, to have programs like this, continue to do things. I think the marker at the Dedrick um, 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 cemetery in Orange Mound, that was they put a marker up there. We need a marker for slaves of some kind, maybe not a historical marker, maybe a statue or something, because they really built this city. I mean, the foundation for the city, the economic foundation of this city, the infrastructure was all built by slaves. But I think us talking about it, making sure that it's taught in schools, despite the recent opposition, this is so important. Um, and um, um, and and I think the important thing is to bring out the humanity of everybody, right? I mean, the McGees, as awful as they were human beings who had motivations that maybe we can't fully understand and have a perspective that we, I don't think, want to understand, in many ways. But nevertheless, they are human beings who are walking through this earth just like Lewis and Matilda Hughes are. And while I would give more weight to Lewis and Matilda simply because their stories are never told, but and making sure, people have a tendency, especially down here, to think, well, if you're attacking the past, somebody in the past, you're attacking me. And that's not true. That's nonsense. That's not the purpose of this. And I think more public programs, I think more public public discussions, more public commemoration. I think we need, I hope that as Juneteenth becomes, it's now a national holiday, let's hope that we can do some programming around that the city can honor that, and we can honor Lewis Hughes, Lewis and Matilda, and Henry Davidson, and Mary Herndon, and all of these other people that we talk about that are listed in the book and who've been documented by others, so that they can be incorporated within, so that their names can be as prominent as the Snowdens and the Crumps and the, and so on. Because we're not trying to push anybody out. We're just trying to bring more people in, and that's, and being honest about it, and also being honest about why we're doing this is, I think, very important. But God, we've got to talk about this, and we've got to, uncomfortable or not. I mean, and if I tell people, history is not a morality play. If you're looking for heroes, look somewhere else, because you're going to be looking at human beings who, the best of us are flawed. The best of us make mistakes. The best of us have blind spots. And if you simply want heroes, you need to look somewhere else. And so that is, we've got to, we've got to do more. And I'm meandering it on, but I really think that we need more talking, more public programming. I have hoped that we could do some version of a truth and reconciliation program here, not, to simply lay out the facts, to simply share the stories, and white people in particular have got to understand that Lewis and Matilda Hughes is their story too. We're not divorced from this, and we're not stock villains. And so I feel it's interesting. I feel closer to Henry Davidson, Lewis and Matilda Hughes, Mary Herndon, and a few others. I feel closer to them than any other people I've ever written about. And when the book was over, I kind of hated for it to be over, because they became people that I cared about, and the fact that I'm white, and that had I been living in the 1840s, I would have been caught up in the slave culture one way or the other. Whether I owned slaves or not, I would have benefited from it. And but we have to get over the fact that there are no white people or black people. We use that to describe people, and certainly when we're describing the past, we have to do that, because you wouldn't be able to understand it if you didn't. But at the same time, we have to preach that we are all human beings. That's ultimately what we are. And if I'm telling the story of Lewis Hughes, does not diminish a white person's story, and vice versa. Yeah, we've got to do more. We've got to do more.
Very well said. Thank you, Wayne. And I see in the comments we have a suggestion of tours. And I know that we mentioned Slave Haven Underground Railroad, but there's several other African American centered tours that are available in Memphis. For instance, a tour possibilities,
Yeah.
which is led by Miss Carolyn Michael Banks, who's in attendance today. And if you ever get the chance
Yeah.
to experience that journey, I would encourage you all to, because it definitely talks about the history of slavery in Memphis and moves through the modern histories that we know are associated with Memphis. Yes, so thank you all.
Absolutely.
And so thank you, Mr. Wayne. Thank you for that just breadth of just information and for sharing your book with us. I encourage everyone to pick it up and read it. It is an amazing read. It's very insightful. It's very engaging, and it's definitely, we need more books like Mr. Dowdy's publication. And so, as we get ready to conclude our first virtual book series, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Again, our next book series will be held on Thursday, March the 10th. Where we will host Dr. Ernestine Jenkins and her latest publication, Black Artists in America, from Great Depression to Civil Rights. We have other events coming up for the Memphis Heritage Trail. On February the 28th, 2022, at the Halloran Center, we have our annual Trailblazer Awards. This event is free to the public. You are encouraged to register via Eventbrite, as seating is limited. The reception will start at 4:30 and the ceremony will begin at 5:30. Forthcoming in the spring, the Memphis Heritage Trail will launch new wayfinding signage in South City and Soulsville neighborhoods. There you can learn more about the rich history of the communities as well as the residents who made it all happen. We also have several redevelopment efforts going on in Orange Mound by way of the historic Melrose High School. So I encourage you all to visit the Memphis Heritage Trail website at www.memphisheritagetrail.com, where you can learn more about what's going on in the community of Orange Mound, as well as several endeavors with the Memphis Heritage Trail. Also, we welcome you to download our app, where you can learn more about the residential loops, the civil rights loop, the commerce loop, and the entertainment loop as well. We also are on all social media platforms. We've launched on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So we encourage you, and we are on YouTube as well. We encourage you all to like, share all things Memphis Heritage Trail, and tell us what you thought about our virtual book series on today. We also encourage, in lieu of a virtual event, for you to leave your name and email address in the comment so that we can keep you updated on all things going on with the trail. And this concludes our first virtual series. We hope to see you all back next month. Again, thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all again in March. You all take care, and you have a wonderful rest of your day.